Okay, so my name's Austin, and this is my third video in the series, or fourth. It's a video in the series of why I love the novel Infinite Jest. And this is the first video in which I'm going to talk about a, specific passage of the book and not just the book in general. The passage that I'm going to talk about is in Note 67, which corresponds to page 196. This note comes in the description of the, EMPHH facility and all the different units in that, and how, like Ennet House is the number 6 unit within this whole public health hospital facility. And it walks through the units sort of one by one, describing them. And, one of the units is unit number 5, which is referred to as the shed. And it's called this because this unit treats catatonic patients. That it is called the shed because the people don't move or anything. It's more like the people are stored there as opposed to being treated. At least that's what it seems like. The part of the note that I find relevant is when they describe that, not every patient on the unit is truly catatonic in sort of the physiological way. That there's, at least one patient who's there out of, psychological reasons. And sort of what the note says is, the cops explain that the lady is not catatonic in the strict sense of catatonic, but rather a DP, which is mental health facility slang for debilitatingly phobic. Her deal is apparently that she's almost psychotically terrified of the possibility that she might be either blind or paralyzed or both. So e.g., she keeps her eyes shut tight 24/7, 365, out of the reasoning that as long as she keeps her eyes shut tight, she can find hope in the possibility that if she was to open them, she'd be able to see, they say. But that if she were ever to actually open her eyes and actually not be able to see, she reasons, she's lost that precious like margin of hope that she's maybe not blind. Then they run through her similar reasoning behind sitting absolutely motionless out of a phobia of being paralyzed. So, the reason why I like this note is because, it's just one of the many situations and, it's one of the situations in which this book is able to take a very important idea and put it into a very important abstraction. Because, there are reasons why this situation couldn't occur in real life. But so it sort of existed in this very fictional way, but, I think it really is a good example of illustrating what I consider to be one of the main points of this book, is that, at a certain point, reasoning stops to matter. Like the reasoning of a human being kind of needs to be thrown out the window, and that some people, once they reach a certain point, just have to stop burdening themselves with rationality. Right? That's something that's explained over and over again when talking about a lot of newcomers into AA and how they have to learn to accept sort of what feel like the absurdities of the program. And I think this story manages to capture that whole idea that gets described in detail much later on in a very, short, nice, bow tied up kind of way. And what I mean by that is this, woman, that it's very easy to look at her from like a very instantaneous take on this, is that, she's wrong about something that is more or less kind of obvious, that she has no reason to believe that she's blind, or she has no reason to believe that she's paralyzed, and she's just wrong, and she's delusional about, something that's real. And maybe if people could just convince her that if she had like a debilitatingly phobic, that if they could just convince her that these things are just phobias and they're not real, then maybe she would open her eyes and try to move around. But, that's just one sort of, like I said, my instantaneous take on that situation. But if you think about it a little bit more, it's really not the main issue in this woman's life, or excuse me, is not a problem that needs to be solved. She doesn't need to figure out whether or not she's right or wrong about being blind or paralyzed or both. What she has to realize is that in either situation, whether she is or isn't blind, what she is doing is the worst possible option for her. For example, if she isn't blind, obviously opening her eyes will let her know that, and then she can go about her life in a way where she's not lying in a bed. But also at the same time, if she is correct about being blind, her best option is to still open her eyes and just confirm this fact, because then she can try to go about living the best life possible as a blind person, because, whatever that might be, whether she's blind or paralyzed or both, if she goes about accepting this, then she can probably live a much better life than she is right now. So, this is sort of a situation where trying to apply reasoning to this individual is not necessary and probably will keep someone trapped in a phobia, right? You can talk all day about, you don't have proof that you're blind, you don't have proof that you're paralyzed, all these different things. But another way to look at this is to suggest that, reasoning doesn't matter. Being right or wrong doesn't matter. Whether or not what the truth is of, what would happen if you open your eyes, none of these things really matter. All that you need to know is that whether or not you're blind, opening your eyes is your best option. Whether or not you're paralyzed, trying to move is your best option. And in this situation, that completely eliminates any need of knowing whether or not you're blind. And, I think this story is just a good example of, an idea that really comes up later. And it's something about this book that I think is really special, sort of its ways to take these huge sort of overarching ideas of, being rational has gotten you so far, why don't you try to be irrational for a while? Thinking you need to know everything has gotten you into the point where you're in a halfway house. Maybe try living a life in which you don't need to know everything. And that's a major idea and something that gets discussed a lot with, Gately and a lot of the newcomers in Ennett House. But it gets captured really well in the story. And, I just think that's one of the many things that this book does very well. Anyways.